Yes. A very good morning to all the doctors again. We shall start with our first session, and I would welcome our chairman, Dr. Bakulesh Kumar, to please come on screen. I guess all the doctors are on screen. Moving on, I would also like to welcome co-chairman, Professor Pradyot Narayan Biswas. A very good morning, sir. I would also
Very
like
good morning.
Dr. Vivek Wani.
Morning.
Good morning, sir. I would like to welcome convener, Dr. Jad Chandra. A very good morning, sir. I guess he's between us.
Yeah, good morning.
Chandra is here. Yes.
Good morning, sir. I would like to welcome our co-convener, Dr. Manisha Agarwal.
Morning.
Morning, ma'am.
Morning.
I would like to welcome another co-convener, Dr. Pramod Sadashivrao Bhinde.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning, sir. Now I would like to welcome our moderators, Dr. Sangeeta Mittal and Dr. Sachin Mahuli.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Dr. Sangeet Mittal, by the way.
Yes, I was just preparing.
So I think now we should start because we are already getting late.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ritu
Yes,
Singh,
I would.
I'll invite Dr. Ritu Singh to share her screen.
Yes, sir.
So you have to
I
stick.
hope my screen
that
is
6
visible
minutes.
and
Yeah, it is visible
I am
now.
audible. Yes.
Yes, you are audible. Yeah.
All right.
You can make it full screen.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I shall be ready to go as soon as you tell me.
Ma'am, your time has already started. Please.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
start. Please go ahead.
A very good morning to all the respected delegates and the early birdies, the audience here. I'm Dr. Ritu Singh from King George's Medical University of Lucknow, and I'm here to present my free paper on the topic Trojan horse anesthesia, a novel method of anesthesia for pars plana vitrectomy. Well, I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose, and the aim of the study was to evaluate the patient comfort and surgical safety using lignocaine jelly augmented with intracameral lignocaine solution for anesthetizing the eyes undergoing PPV. Topical anesthesia, as we all know, has been in use for anterior segment surgery.
Louder, please, madam.
Topical anesthesia has been in use for anterior segment surgeries routinely with acceptable patient comfort and surgical safety. But later onset, we have tried to use the same anesthesia for the posterior segment surgeries as well. And pars plana vitrectomy is one of those surgeries being done under topical anesthesia since the advent of 23 and 25 gauge vitrectomy systems. Now, why do we need to improve and explore other modalities to alleviate pain? Because despite the topical anesthesia that we are using, there are various studies that have shown that sclerostomy, scleral indentation, and endolaser are a few steps where the patient have been demonstrated to still complain of moderate to severe pain. And the surgeries so far give us two main ideas that anterior segment surgeries done using lignocaine jelly are more beneficial when compared to drop, and topical anesthesia supplemented with intracameral lignocaine are more beneficial in anterior segment surgeries. These studies are quoted here. So this is what we used in our Trojan horse anesthesia. Well, Trojan horse is actually a tale that everybody knows is from the Greek mythology, and it was used by the Greeks to enter the city and win the war. It is, in a nutshell, an expression that we can easily, it's a tool that we can easily enter a closed perimeter and then used to gain any unobstructed access by disarming the guarding elements. So this is what we do. We first instill the lignocaine jelly and the eye is topically anesthetized. Therefore, when we enter intracamerally, there is nearly painless delivery of anesthesia when compared to retrobulbar or peribulbar. The pain-sensitive uveal tissue is directly anesthetized because we instill it in the anterior chamber. And since the ciliary ganglion is spared, we preserve the eyelid and eye movements, and there is therefore no need to patch the eye out post-surgery. My study was a prospective interventional tertiary care center-based study, and it was conducted after we received the green flag from the Institutional Ethical Committee, and the study adhered to the tenets of the Declaration of Helsinki. The sample size was 107 patients. There were a total of 114 which were recruited, but only 107 could passed the inclusion criteria. That was patients who were indicated of PPV other than retinal detachment. The table on the right shows the enlisted patients. The exclusion criteria included pregnant or nursing women, any patient who was uncooperative and could not abide by the verbal commands, allergy to the components of the medicine, any concomitant use of topical or systemic NSAID, prostaglandins, or parasympathomimetics, the maximum pupillary dilatation being at least 6 millimeters, and we omitted people who had any pupillary deformity or retinal detachment as their cause. The surgical technique included first, a lignocaine jelly was instilled 5 to 10 minutes prior to the surgery and reinstilled after draping. Following adequate topical anesthesia, we entered the chamber by a 1.8 millimeter sized keratome, and intracameral irrigation solution was injected, which was nothing but 1 milliliter of 2% preservative-free lignocaine mixed in 1 ml of balanced salt solution. Following which a normal 3-port PPV was done using 23-gauge system. And lastly, we inspected for sclerostomy ports for proper sealing. If not, we even sutured if Vicryl 80 was required. In our surgery, the gender distribution was such that there were at least 62% of the patients were majorly males, and the mean age was 42. The intraoperative time ranged from 13 minutes to 80 minutes with an average of 40 minutes. The grading of the pain was done on a 10 centimeters visual analog scale, and 87% of the patients opted for topical anesthesia to be used again. The box whisker plot on the right-hand side shows the same. And there was a weak positive correlation with age and the duration of surgery. That was 0.28 for the age and 0.26 for duration of surgery. The image on the left-hand side shows a histogram for the pain analog scale, which was on the 10 centimeter visual analog scale, and majority of the patients complained of a pain scale ranging from 3 to 5. And those patients who rejected for a repeat surgery under topical anesthesia were majorly under the class of greater than 5 scale. So that means most of the patients who opted for topical anesthesia, that means 87% of the patients, were those who had rated 3 in their VAS score. Also, the pain experience was unaffected by education status, gender, or any additional procedures such as intraocular implantation or silicone oil installation. To conclude, Trojan horse anesthesia is a very beneficial and gives adequate analgesia for comfortable and safe 23-gauge PPV. And the pain experience is not affected by any of those parameters. So we can go ahead with it and perform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ritu. You can stop sharing your screen now. We have time for 2 questions.
Can I ask question?
Yeah, sure.
How you ensure asepsis when you use the jelly during surgery?
Sir, pardon, sir, your voice cracked in between. Sir.
No, how you ensure asepsis? Pre-operative antibiotic or iopre?
Asepsis.
Huh? So
ensuring. Sir, I'm very sorry.
Asepsis.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you put.
Sir,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So just like any other intraocular surgery, we start a 4th generation fluoroquinolone, that is moxifloxacin 0.5% QID in all our patients 2 days prior to the surgery, sir. They are seen in the OPD, and this was
on table.
Sir, on table, sir. Sir, povidone iodine of 5% was instilled in the conjunctival cul-de-sac, and it was twice injected. It's a routine procedure.
Before lignocaine, after lignocaine jelly.
So this was before the lignocaine, and we instilled lignocaine twice, sir. So one was on the just before the OT procedure. We instilled betadine. We instilled lignocaine following it. Once the patient was shifted to the OT and we were supposed to drape it, we again instilled povidone iodine for 3 minutes, sir. So this is.
No, you pour over the jelly or before jelly?
So it was over the jelly only, sir.
Over the jelly.
We wiped it off. I mean, it was just before, but we did not wipe it
Yeah,
off.
Dr. Parizat is
So
smiling
that
now.
is
What he got my question. Okay. And another question is, where you are not had a combined surgery, just only posterior segment approach, why you need to inject lignocaine in an anterior chamber? I can understand combined surgery if you are doing anterior segment approach, nucleus removal, IOL removal. Why you use a lignocaine intracameral?
So basically, it has been seen that even if we performed just by applying topical lignocaine jelly, when we perform vitrectomy, the disturbances inside tend to generate pain because the pain-sensitive structures are anyway disturbed. And using this technique of Trojan horse, it has been seen that patients are very well comfortable, and we can. I mean, it was a good surgeon experience following this, even if it was a plain PPP surgery.
Thank you, sir. I think we should move to the next because the time is up. So next talk is Dr. Amandeep Hans.
Thank you, sir.
He has not joined. So next is by Dr. Raghudev Bhattacharjee. Dr. Raghudev is here. He is not here. So then, sir, I'll start my talk today. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah. Okay.
Sir. Dr. Mittal. Hello. Dr. Mittal.
Sangeet, people, those are not present on time, are we going to allow them to present again later on or no?
Sir, I think if we have time, we'll allow them. If we won't, then it will be difficult because they're not informed also. I think they have not informed me. I don't know if they have informed Dr. Sachin.
Dr. Sangeet Mittal, Dr. Partha is here. Dr. Partha.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, Sangeet, I think you're a presenter also here, and I think you're a judge as well. Is it not?
No, sir. I'm not judging I'm just moderating the session.
No. The moderators are also judges, so therefore you as a moderator, you can just be a moderator but not a judge. Okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. All chairpersons, meaning chairpersons, convener, moderators, co-chairpersons, everybody is a judge. Okay. But Sangeet, since you have conflict of interest and you are a presenter, so you will not mark any of the sessions.
No, I won't mark.
Right. Thank you so much, Sangeet. Thank you. So please carry on. Any other problem that I can help with?
No, sir, it's fine, sir. Sir, one thing is like if somebody is not presented, if somebody is not in time and has not informed
last, he will come last.
Okay, right.
He will come in last. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Carry on, please.
Okay, sir, can I request you to please continue your session as I don't want this hall to run. Thank you.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Sangeet.
Okay, right. So I'll present, the aim of the study was to present a novel technique of draining subretinal and suprachoroidal fluid using a 26 gauge IV cannula, which is attached to the extrusion pump of vitrectomy console. And this was a retrospective case series, and 11 eyes underwent this procedure. And this is how we do it.
Sangeet, we cannot hear. Hello?
Pardon, sir?
We could not hear you.
Could not hear you.
I'll start. Actually. So once the site of maximum elevation is identified, the 26 gauge IV cannula is inserted in the quadrant of the maximum elevation. This is done 6 to 10 millimeters away from the limbus with the bevel away position. Once the cannula pierces the coats, you feel a change in pressure at your fingertips. Then you examine your cannula tip inside with your wide field system. Once you ensure that, you advance the plastic cannula inside and then remove the metallic stellate. You can see the fluid coming out. You can then attach this to the extrusion pump of your machine, and you can control the speed of the rate of fluid by using the active foot controlled suction machine of the machine. Now you see the retinal detachment is getting shallower when we start the suction on the machine. So in this patient, we did this study, and 11 patients with RD with choroidal detachment, one with the suprachoroidal hemorrhage post-traumatic, one with the post-cataract surgery expulsive hemorrhage, 2 patients with post-trabeculectomy choroidal detachment, 8 patients with a bullous retinal detachment, 2 with the bullous combined RD and PDR, 1 of uveal effusion syndrome, and 1 with Coats disease. So these cases were analyzed, and this technique offers various surgical advantages. And just 2 advantages of this technique, let us look at some of these cases. So this was a 56 years female who presented with a recurrent retinal detachment with massive choroidals extending posteriorly to the scleral buccal. In this case, this IV cannula was used to drain the suprachoroidal fluid. This Teflon cannula is very malleable and it can be maneuvered easily in subretinal and suprachoroidal space. This cannula also conforms to the available space and reduces the risk of any retinal or choroidal injury. And because the tip is blunt, you need not remove it as choroids the detachment gets shallow. Again, because it is transconjunctival, you can drain sides. And because of its length, you can even go up to posteriorly, even up to the macula. And because the risk of injury with this cannula is low, you can, and it does not need any visualization while doing the surgery, you can carry out other procedures with the cannula even inside. So the endolaser. This was another case of post-traumatic choroidal detachment and hemorrhage with the intraocular foreign body. The choroidals were very high, so the vitrectomy could not be easily performed. So again, this cannula was used to, you see how fast the choroidals are decreased when you do it in a fast mode. Once the choroidals become shallow, you switch off to the slow mode. Again, this is a patient of combined retinal detachment, and retina can be flattened using this technique, and you need not make early retinotomies which may hamper your surgery later on. So you can carry out your membrane dissection without creating any retina. This was again a patient with Coats disease. Retina was behind the lens. There was no space to insert instruments, and you drain the fluid here, and thus this prevents the conversion of an exudative retinal detachment to a rhegmatogenous retinal detachment. You can just drain the fluid and perform your other procedures, like if you want to do a vitrectomy, or you want to do laser, or you want to inject intravitreal triamcinolone, you can use it accordingly. But this technique also has some limitations. There is a theoretical risk of retinal injury or break formation, which can be minimized by prior examination of insertion site and choosing the point of maximum elevation. Then tissue incarceration can block the tip of the cannula and can be prevented by decreasing the suction rate when the detachment becomes shallow. And one of the Chandelier-assisted scleral buckling was found to have star folds after flattening the retina, had to be converted to vitrectomy. To conclude, I'll just say that 26-gauge intravenous catheter, it provides a simple and safe option for draining subretinal and suprachoroidal fluid in various situations in a controlled manner. Thank you.
I think it's a nice technique, Dr. Sangeet. And especially when we are dealing with bullous detachments, where we always have the problem of even inserting the instruments. If we can do a transcameral drainage, I think that is going to really be helpful and avoiding many complications. Have you ever tried this technique for draining the suprachoroidal blood? Has this technique worked in that?
Yes, in this series only we had 2 cases. One was a post-cataract surgery choroidal suprachoroidal hemorrhage, and one was a post-traumatic choroidal hemorrhage with the detachment along with it. So in those cases, we generally wait for around 20 days for the blood to liquefy and then drain the blood. Yeah.
Dr. Mittal, to
Yes.
avoid draining by this method, by the traditional methods, you are also using pars-plana vitrectomy instruments. Will it not add to the cost of the surgery? Suppose you are doing only buccal, but you are still putting infusion cannula and everything, then you are draining it by your method. So how does it become cost effective versus steel buckle and traditional drainage?
So most of these cases needed vitrectomy for other indications like rhegmatogenous retinal detachment or PDR other things. And secondly, when you are draining your suprachoroidal fluid or subretinal fluid, a sudden outpour of the fluid may result in complications like hemorrhage or hyphema during the procedure. And for that, you need to have some kind of infusion inside the eye before you start draining. So,
But you mentioned there is only one case where you went for vitrectomy. All other cases were not associated with vitrectomy.
no, sir. All cases vitrectomy was done along with this drainage procedure in these series. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I now invite the next speaker. Dr. Himadri Chaudhary, she is
Yes, I'm here.
Dr. Himadri Chaudhary.
Yes, I'm here, sir. Am I
Okay,
audible?
okay, Dr. Himadri, you can share your screen now and you can put your video and audio on.
Sure, sir. Is it visible, sir?
Yes, your screen is visible. And make it full screen.
That's fine, sir. Now?
Yes, yes, sure.
Okay. Should I start, sir? A very good morning to one and all present here. I'll be talking on the role of ILM peeling in diabetic retinopathy. Do not have any financial interests. Proliferative diabetic retinopathy is one of the leading causes of severe visual loss in patients with diabetes. Pan-retinal photocoagulation has been the treatment of choice since the 1970s. However, we have to go for vitrectomy in certain cases of chronic vitreous hemorrhage, fractional or combined RDs. And some surgeons prefer to peel the ILM after staining to achieve better postoperative visual results. So with this background, the purpose of the study was to evaluate whether ILM peeling was of any benefit and to evaluate the central macular thickness and visual acuity in patients undergoing PPV for complications of proliferative diabetic retinopathy. It was a retrospective study. We divided the patients into two groups. Group A underwent PPV with ILM peeling and Group B underwent PPV without ILM peeling. In both the groups, a patient received injection bevacizumab 0.5 ml 1 week prior to vitrectomy. So this was a patient in the non-ILM peeling group. This was a patient in the non-ILM peeling group. The patient was one-eyed and also had a cataract. So initially the patient underwent a cataract surgery along with the injection of bevacizumab. A week later, vitrectomy was done. 4-port vitrectomy was done, and the 4th port was the chandelier illumination. Now, the initial steps were, as in all other vitrectomies, triamcinolone was used to highlight the posterior hyaloid, and chandelier illumination and self-indentation was used for peripheral vitreous shaving. In the end, we went for a pan-retinal photocoagulation and a fluid air exchange. This was another patient in the ILM peeling group. So initially, we removed the vitreous, the posterior hyaloid. Then, using the cutter segmentation delamination technique, the polyp removed. ILM was peeled under air using brilliant blue G. Then came the peeling. We initiated the peel using the pinch peel technique. Now, one thing to remember here is that ILM tends to be very adherent to the underlying surface. So the peeling has to be extremely gentle, and the angle of pull is almost parallel to the surface of the retina. The ILM tends to break off at times, and we might have to regrasp the ILM again and again. We tend to regrasp after every 1 or 2 clock hours of peel. Again, like I mentioned, the peel has to be very slow and very gentle. We have to do it almost parallel to the surface of the retina. And we tend to prefer a larger peel, that is from arcade to arcade. Now, after every clock hours, we have to regrasp because the ILM tends to break off otherwise. And it's slightly more challenging than in cases of macular holes. So once the peeling is done, we lower the IOP for some time to check for any bleeders, and then go ahead with the pan-retinal photocoagulation and injection of air or silicone oil. Sometimes we encountered these taut ILM, which are very adherent. And again, the process of the peeling was basically the same. We had to have a very gentle technique, and multiple grasping and regrasping had to be done. Once the ILM peeling is complete, we usually went ahead with the fluid air exchange and a silicone oil injection. Now coming to the results, the mean age in group A was 64.6 and 61.9 in group B. The mean duration was comparable in both the groups. The preoperative visual acuity in group 1 was 2.3 logmar and 2.1 in group B. And there was significant visual improvement after the surgery. The mean central macular thickness was noted to be slightly lower in the ILM peel group compared to the non-ILM peel group. It was statistically insignificant. One thing which we noticed was that epiretinal membrane were more common in the non-peeling group post-surgery. Now, this is something similar to the findings which have been described in literature. ILM peeling does minimize the incidence of epiretinal membrane formation. However, it was noted that it does not improve the visual outcome. The visual outcomes in both the groups are generally the same. So to conclude, ILM peeling does have a role. It prevents formation of the epiretinal membrane, although the visual function does not change significantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Himadri. We have around 2 minutes for the discussion.
I just have a quick clarification from Dr. Himadri. You said 0.5 ml of Avastin was injected.
No,
Is that
0.05. Sorry. Yeah.
Right.
The inclusion criteria is not controlled, no? I mean, you're just going blindly inside vitreous hemorrhage and you are peeling in some groups and not peeling in some of the cases. We don't know if they have macular edema or don't have macular edema. Some have, as you showed very nicely, dense ERMs. Some have just a normal macula behind the vitreous hemorrhage. So, you know, it's how do you compare these groups? No, I mean, the one which you say that it's 197. I mean, that could be in a group where, you know, there was not significant traction on the macula, whereas in the other group where you have, you might having much more severe traction. So it's difficult to control the inclusion groups and, you know, compare them unless we have a very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria in this study. It's difficult to compare the CMT, I believe, most of.
Yes, I agree, sir.
Any other question, or then we move on to our next speaker? So our next speaker is Dr. Tapas Ranjan Padi. Is he here, Dr. Tapas? Yeah, let's start his screen. If you can unmute yourself and start.
Very good morning. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah, you are audible.
Respected panelists and friends, with pleasure, I take you through this interesting study. Can rate of retinal vascular outgrowth be a predictor of treatment need in babies with retinopathy of prematurity? I don't have any financial interest to disclose. So this was, as we know, retinopathy of prematurity is a disorder of premature retinal vasculature. Multiple factors like prematurity, low birth weight, oxygen, poor weight gain, collateral health issues affect the vascular outgrowth, and this decides the extent and severity of retinopathy of prematurity. In this study, we intended to analyze the rate of retinal vascular outgrowth in disc diameter per week in treatment-naive eyes with various stages of retinopathy of prematurity, and evaluated whether they could be a predictor of treatment need. This was a 10-year study extending from 2010 to 2019 December, partly retrospective and partly prospective, done at LV Prasad Eye Institute, Bhubaneswar, and was approved by the Institutional Review Board. We included babies with retinopathy of prematurity, with clear fundus images, and with disc and vascular endings clearly visible in one go. Those with incomplete details, poor image quality, stage 4 and 5, and those without consent were excluded. We used both platforms, RETCAM, Shuttle, as well as Phoros Neo to do the calculations. The quadrants analyzed included superatemporal quadrant, inferotemporal quadrant, inferonasal, supranosal, horizontal nasal, and horizontal temporal. Measurements were done by 2 retina specialists, masked to the postmenstrual age and treatment details. A third examiner cross-checked the calculations. While the RETCAM Shuttle had an inbuilt caliper option for calculation for Phoros Neo, we used a scale. The measurements were done from the either midpoint of the temporal or nasal disc margin up to the blood vessels end. The red-green enhancement was used to make the blood vessels prominent, and the speed was, as shown here, the distance from the disc margin up to the blood vessel end divided by the horizontal disc diameter divided by post-menstrual age at calculation minus 17. Assuming that the blood vessels reach the temporal disc margin at 17 weeks of gestational age. These are the statistics we used. We compared the speed in different groups, also compared the horizontal disc diameter between the groups. The interclass correlation coefficient was used to assess for the reproducibility, and finally ROC curve to assess the predictive value of the speed and decision for treatment need. There were 3 groups, group 1 with 238 eyes, group 2 spontaneous regression, group 3 prematurity but no ROP. The group 1 was further subdivided as is shown here. The rate was maximum in those with no ROP, that is 0.71 plus or minus 0.10 disc diameter per week, and was lowest in those requiring treatment, that is 0.49. The subgroup analysis showed that the speed was lowest in APROP group, followed by threshold, hybrid, and followed by high risk pre-threshold. There was no statistical significant difference between the horizontal disc diameter among the different groups. While we calculated all the quadrants, the examiners preferred to calculate the supratemporal and inferotemporal quadrant. We saw that the speed less than 0.40 disc diameter per week, about 99% required treatment. When we plotted the ROC curve, it showed that rate of vascular outgrowth is a significant predictor of treatment need, and at a cutoff value 0.56 in supratemporal quadrant, 0.57 in inferotemporal, 0.54 in horizontal temporal quadrant, the accuracy of predictability is as shown here. Limitations, the most important limitations was the measurements we did on a flat laptop computer screen, while in reality the blood vessels traverse a curved ocular surface. Lack of FFA could have delineated the blood vessels better, but we compensated this by using the red-green enhancement to make the blood vessels stand out. The rate of vascular growth assumed to be uniform throughout the study period between 2 points of time, but actually it might not be so, because depending on the systemic status, the growth rate might change. The rate can be different in different quadrant. We address this by calculating the rate in different quadrant, taking their average, as well as in individual quadrant and comparing the individual quadrants.
Dr. Tapas, you have to conclude now.
So to conclude, retinal vascular outgrowth is quantifiable and could predict the treatment need for ROP. The rate is inversely proportional to the disease severity. At less than 0.5 disc diameter per week, the speed can be a good predictor of treatment need. I thank you all for kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tapas.
Thank you, Tapas. Very nice presentation.
Very, very nice presentation, Dr. Tapas. One small question. So is there any way to tell that we have to treat it before the clinical features of type 1 retinopathy develop by your method.
Yes, sir. So the speed that we analyzed here is not the predictor of treatment. Multiple factors decide, but when we see that the rate of speed of vascularization less than 0.5, it alerts one that there is a high chance that these babies will need treatment. They need closer follow-up and extra stress on the systemic factors, which can be modified to alter the treatment outcome.
Nice. Actually,
please stop sharing your screen.
the standard deviation is also a little overlapping between the three groups. So that's also a concern, but it's a very good study and very elaborately done. But the clinical use will be little difficult to determine, because most of us will be always following ROP by the features of type 1, and as soon as it's reached, we treat.
Yes, sir. The reason we undertook this study is that because while examining these babies, I saw that the cases where the vascular outgrowth is slow, like you see the blood vessels remain stunted for a long period of time, they ultimately require treatment more often. If someone calls them, say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then in between the subject eye reaches a treatment stage. So if we see and in our mind imagine that how many distance away is the vascular ending in terms of the horizontal disc diameter, we can keep in mind that probably these are the babies, these are the eyes, they will need treatment more often.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tapas. So now we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Gopeswari Hota. Dr. Gopeswari, are you there? Person is not here, so we next move on to Dr. B. Poon Chandra.
I'm here, sir. I can share my screen.
Sure. You can start sharing your screen now.
So you can see my screen, sir?
Yes.
Is it in full screen mode, sir?
No, not it.
Not in full screen.
No, not in the full screen. Now it is.
Okay. Can I start, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So it's asking some message start video. Okay, sir. Now I can start. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Myself, Dr. Purna Chandra. I will be presenting my paper on polarization sensitivity, OCT utility in degenerative retinal disease. No financial disclosures. So as we know, we come a long way from 1996 time domain OCTs to the recent onset swept source OCT. And histology will always remain the gold standard to analyze these retinal layers, but it can't be done in clinical scenarios. We designed a custom-made polarization sensitive OCT with ultra high resolution, which can also generate in-phase images, which was not available in earlier models. So the main difference compared to the ST OCT and Bioptigen lies here, where better scan rate, maximum depth penetration, better pixel density, obviously a better resolution. So the conventional OCT just measures only the measurement of the reflected light. PS OCT considers the polarized state of the reflected light also. That's the difference. For example, if a light passes through a collagen layer, there will be change in phase retardation and axis orientation. Accordingly, map will be constructed, like phase retardation and axis orientation map, which generates both B scans and N phase images. This is the B scan image of a phase retardation map in a PS OCT. And this is an axis orientation map. They are color coded. There will be change in color if there is any functional or structural changes, and both these complement each other. As I told, it can also generate N-phase images corresponding to the interlimiting membrane, outer plexiform layer, ellipsoid zone, and RPE layer. Interestingly, we observed a bow tie pattern corresponding to the ellipsoid zone. I'll come to this later. So aim of our study was to study this efficacy of PSOCT in degenerative diseases. It was an observational study approved by Institutional Review Board, and informed consent were taken by patients and the guardians, where a total of 50 eyes were studied, 25 normal eyes, 18 eyes were RP, which were again subdivided into early and advanced based on the visual acuity. 7 eyes were Stargardts. All patients underwent detailed clinical examination, imaging, including electrophysiological tests. A PSOCT of 840 nanometer wavelength was used, where phase retardation and axis orientation and phase maps were analyzed. So only those retinal images which were after compensating for corneal birefringence were used for further analysis. So this is how we routinely examine a case of retinitis pigmentosa Stargardt's. This is an autofluorescence image and OCT, and we are all quite familiar with these changes. Let's see what additional information PSOCT can add. So this is the phase retardation map. If you compare to the normal and retinitis pigmentosa Stargardt, there's a total distortion at each and every layer, and this bow tie pattern is also getting distorted. The same thing can be repeated in axis orientation map also. So RP is the most relevant structure for photoreceptor function under this study also, because it caused a depolarizing material. If there is an RP atrophy, depolarization can be seen in choroid also, mainly because of melanin granules. And we all know like melanin concentration is more in central region. So if you look at the phase retardation map compared to the intensity images, the maximum depolarization is seen in RP layer, retinal pigment epithelium. Rest of the layers has got more or less similar depolarization. So basically, if there is a better functional integrity, there will be more depolarization. So there will be increased phase retardation and axis orientation changes. This is the gist. So when we overlaid this phase retardation and axis orientation, we could see that as there is an RP atrophy advances, the more and more choroidal depolarization pattern can be observed if the RP advances, and it's more in Stargardt's. As we know, like the Stargardt's will have a more atrophic outer retina and RP changes. One more interesting factor what we observed was this patient, though we could hardly make out any ellipsoid zone, still patient had 618 vision. If you observe carefully, RP is still giving some depolarization signal, indicating there is some talking going on between the RP and the photoreceptor. This even the multifocal ERG failed to pick up. And this is of a different patient, and these were repeatable across the patient, both the phase retardation and the axis orientation map. You can see the deterioration of bow tie pattern. All these were quantified, and these were statistically significant. Coming to the discussion, we know like histopathological studies have proved beyond doubt that in RP, rods are first to degenerate, followed by cones, then our retinal pigment epithelium, followed by ganglion cells. Supporting this hypothesis, the present study, the mean phase retardation was more in group 1 RP than group 2. And the RP layer had shown a decreased phase retardation starting from the center to the periphery. That's how the RP degenerates. It can be near surrogate to an histopathological study. Similarly, in the Stargardt's, we all know like outer retinal thickness get reduced in both cone rod and Stargardt's disease. In our study, eyes had more loss of RP cells, especially near the fovea, which is known. Hyperreflective flex can contribute to higher phase retardation value. One more interesting factor, what we observed was this enlarged RP cells, which have engulfed lipofuscin material. Even if they are dead, they can generate depolarization. This should be kept in mind, and always better to correlate with the color fundus photo and autofluorescence. Coming to the bow tie pattern, normalized, we know like axons of Henle fibers are packed evenly and tightly. So this arrangement combined with corneal birefringence can give rise to bow tie pattern. Whenever there is a photoreceptor damage, there will be a damage to the cell bodies and axons, and radial asymmetric gets disrupted, thereby disrupting this bow tie pattern. So in the current study, we observed that all Stargardt's and 16 out of RP patients had a loss of this bow tie pattern. 2 patients who retained this bow tie pattern had sectoral RP. In the current study, we know that phase retardation changes are more prolific, and retinal tissue does possess interesting depolarization property, and which are more pronounced in a disease state. And we also found a functional loss even in RP1 group who had a better and relatively good vision. To conclude, I would like to say under these settings, what we knew was OCT can delineate structural changes. What this study adds is PSOCT can give insight into the functional integrity. The future will be like PSOCT can be a great tool that can reflect functional change in microenvironment to pick up the disease early, even in other degenerative like AMD, and also monitor clinical trials, example, gene therapy. Thank you.
Thank you. Can stop sharing your screen now. So we have 2 minutes for discussion.
Did you correlate visual acuity with the PSD changes?
Exactly. So that was the first in the RP group. If you see, like the RP were divided based on the visual acuity itself, because we know like in RP, fovea is the last to degenerate, and though structurally OCT existing may give a different details, the functional the vision reflects functional integrity. That's why we took the vision as the criteria. In all patients, where the vision was considered, sir.
So how is the OCT machine modified to do this technique?
Basically, as we know, like in that spectral domain OCT, the spectrometer will have, and there will be a reference image. In between, a polarization mode a module was induced, where the reflected light, before going to the reference mirror, it will check the polarized state of the reflected light. The present OCT, it will receive all the reflected light and gives the images. this polarization sensor will detect the polarized state, then we'll go to the reference images. Then the image gets generated. That's where we are getting this additional information. So depending on the functional integrity of the tissue structure.
Is it a software or a mechanical innovation?
No, the device is mechanical. The finally image gets built based on the software, sir, software algorithm.
Any patients where you found that the changes were there on the OCT, but it did not correlate so much with the visual acuity?
Yes, there were patients. As I told this thing, RP patient where I showed the OCT picture, we could not explain the vision. But when we did the polarization OCT, it did pick up the signal. So hope I understood your question, ma'am, correctly. That was.
Yes, that's right. That is what I was asking.
Okay.
On a multifocal ERG, can you elaborate a little? What were the multifocal ERG with your polarization status?
In RP patients, as we know, like full field ERG always comes unrecordable. We always depend on multifocal ERG to see the subtle changes in the foveolar region. So in this case, as I showed one case example, in very advanced cases RP where patients can have some good vision, even multifocal can come unrecordable. So which is supposed to record some signal. In those cases, the polarization sensitive OCT in our study played an upper hand, where it was showing some depolarization signal, even in the survey. And multifocal ERG was not detecting any signal, but polarization sensitivity detected signal in the RPE, indicating there is some talking going on between the photoreceptor and the RPE. So this is where it scored better than multifocal ERG.
That's interesting. Good.
Thank you, Dr. Poon. I think we should move on to our next speaker. Next speaker is Dr. Rupasri Sethi. Dr. Rupasri, are you here?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can switch on your video and audio. And before you start your presentation, it's my duty to inform you that your presentation will be a non-competitive because your membership is still not certified by AIS.
Yeah.
So now you can share your screen.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So your time has started. You can start your presentation. Make it full screen.
Good morning, respected teachers. Myself, Dr. Rupasri Sethi, going to present my free paper 1643 is about safety and efficacy of suprachoroidal triamcinolone versus intravitreal dexamethasone. So 1 minute. Versus intravitreal dexamethasone in diabetic macular edema patients. Aim of my study to compare the safety and efficacy of suprachoroidal triamcinolone and intravitreal dexamethasone administered as refractory and initial therapy. Diabetic retinopathy is fifth most common cause of preventable blindness worldwide, and diabetic macular edema is seen in 5.2% and 20% of diabetic patients after 4 and 10 years of detection respectively. VEGF and steroid both are the treatment of option, though VEGF is safe and effective, but the recurrence rate and cost factor adds limitations of steroid are an option nowadays. By taking clearance from the ethical committee, we started our 2-year prospective hospital-based study from our department, Bhimsa Bola, with the sample size of 36. We include the patient with DME with controlled type 2 diabetic of fasting blood sugar less than 135 and postprandial blood sugar less than 160 mg per deciliter and central macular thickness between 300 to 600 micrometer, and we exclude the patient with history of vascular disease, scleritis, ischemia in and around a PTDRS 7 standard field, and previously done macular, focal or grid laser therapy, etc. 36 eye who met our criteria, we divided into 2 groups, 18 eyes in each group. Best corrected visual acuity with Logmar chart, slit lamp biomicroscopy, Goldman applanation tonometry, fundus photography, and central macular thickness were measured before and after intervention in every 4-week interval till 24 weeks. In group 1, that is ACTA group, 0.1 ml of triamcinolone is injected in every 8-week interval due to its durability. And in group 2, that is the IVT group, 0.7 milligram implanted once only. This table showing our study results that more than 10-line improvement of mean BCVA occur in ACTA group and more than 8.3 line improvement occur in IVD group. That in ACTA group, the final mean BCVA is 0.46 from 1.48 log mark, and in IVD group it was 0.43 from 1.23 log mark. And mean CMT changes in ACTA group is more than 40%, and in IVD group is more than 30%. That is in ACTA group 323 from 582 micrometer, and in IVD group it was 321 from 483 micrometer. The rise of IOP, that is the development of glaucoma and the progression of cataract, more in number in IVD group as compared to the ACTA group. This is the line diagram showing the mean BCVA improvement after IVD is more gradual as compared to the ACTA group, because in ACTA group, after every injection, after every administration of the doses, the mean BCVA improves till 5th week, and after that it starts gradually deteriorating. Here also we can see the similar result, that the mean CMT improvement is improved in IVD group as compared to the ACTA group. This is the bar diagram showing the mean difference of IOP changes over the 24-week period. In IVD group, the mean changes is more, that is from 15 millimeter of mercury to 20 millimeter of mercury. So the chance of development of glaucoma is more in the IVD group as compared to that of the ACTA group. By comparing our study following IVD, we can see that mean CMT changes over 16 and 24 weeks is similar to that of the Rishi et al. And Mohapatra et al. Study done in 2012 and 2020 respectively. And mean improvement of BCVA is so little discrepancy to Mohapatra study. That is, in our study, it saw 8.3 line improvement over 24 weeks, but in Mohapatra et al. Study, it was only 2.27 to plus or minus 1.83 line. And mean CMT and BCVA improvement following ACTA is showing similar result to that of the TAV et al. Study done at 2020. By comparing our two groups, that is ACTA and IVD group, both are safe and efficacious, and both are improving the BCVAs almost similarly. But in ACTA is more cheaper than IVD, and the complication in ACTA is lesser than IVD because it not coming directly contact to the crystalline lens and the uveal tissue. But ACTA is having less patient compliance as it requires more frequent doses. We conclude our study that mean improvement of BCVA and CMT was gradual, and the hard exudate decreases over 24 weeks due to the stabilization of the blood-retinal barrier in both. Though both are having the equally efficacious and safe, selection of particular steroid can be tailored according to the clinical condition and financial status of the patient. These are my references. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rupasri. You can stop sharing your screen. We have 2 minutes for discussion.
I just had one question for Dr. Rupasri, that you've compared the complications secondary to the intravitreal steroid versus suprachoroidal steroid. But what about the complications secondary to the technique of injecting the drug in the suprachoroidal space?
And also, you have not described the technique of prophylaxis injection.
Right.
Yes, sir. Sir, in suprachoroidal group, we are given in the superior temporal region 3.5 mm away from the limbus, and in IV, and it was given in every 8-week interval.
But how have you injected it in the suprachoroidal? So what have you used to inject it there?
Ma'am, first we are putting the topical anesthesia. Then after that we clean the sclera with the lignocaine, and after then we measure
I
that.
think you did not understand question. How you ensure that drug is gone in a suprachoroidal space?
And what was the technique? What was the instrument that you have used to inject the drug?
Dr. Rupasri wants to know whether you use the microneedle or a catheter or something.
Yes.
What was?
It's not easy to give these injections unless until you have some specialized device.
Sir, yes, sir. We are having the specialist doctor.
Yeah, I think we'll move on to the next, Dr. Sindhak.
Yeah.
Okay, now So we move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Nasik Hassan.
Nasik Hassan, yeah.
Dr. Nasik, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, sir.
Yes, yes.
So I'll just share my screen right.
Yeah, sure. Just to remind the judges, the previous presentation was a non-competitive one.
Yes, sir.
Nasik, you make it full screen.
Yes, sir. Just wait a minute, sir. So is it full screen right now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so good morning, respected panelists and friends. So I'll be presenting my topic, evaluation of deep choroidal vascular changes using on-fast OCT in CSC. And my co-authors are Dr. Rohan Chawla, Dr. Deepak Sundar, and Dr. Nimi Raj. So there are no financial interests to be disclosed. As we all know, CSC comes under the pachychoroid spectrum, which simply means dilatation of the deep choroidal vessels, leading to compression of the middle choroidal vessels and the superficial choriocapillaries. So the purpose of my study was to detect changes in the deep choroidal vasculature of CSC patients during baseline and following resolution using on-fast SSOCT. So we took 9 patients who were diagnosed with CSC and had resolution of the disease either spontaneously or through active intervention, which included medical treatment or PDT or subthreshold laser. And the inclusion criteria involved patients only with NSD, that's the Spitzna's type 1 classification, CSC which resolved within 6 months, and patients with subfoveal and juxtafoveal leaks on FA. Exclusion criteria included those patients with PED, chronic CSC, no complete resolution of fluid, presence of the AA sign or CNV, extrafoveal CSC leaks or diffuse leaks on FA, and patients with high myopia more than -6 diopters. So we used the DRI OCT Triton from TopCon to capture on-fast SSOCT and Octa images. 3 × 3 mm Octa scans were acquired, and so we did a manual segmentation by entering the depth from 150 to 300 microns below the RP and Bruch membrane band, which can be seen here. So they can be done by entering the parameters on the right box. And at this level, what happens is the decorrelation analysis is unable to detect any flow. So we only get on-fast topographical images rather than an angiography image. So after FA was available in all these patients to determine the point of leak. So we have taken this density map. Over here, what we did is the XY localization line was used to mark the leak as superficial vascular layer corresponding to the FFA. So if this was the leak on FFA, it was exactly mapped on the superficial vascular layer, and the underlying deep choroidal vessels was analyzed. The density map was analyzed using the ImageJ software by NIH. So the density map image of the on-fast scan was pixelated using 8-bit to create the black and white image and a grayscale image. Over here, we considered the black spaces to be the lumen and the white areas to be the stroma. So the vessel lumen was delineated manually by a single observer. The demarcation of the area of the lumen was done by marking the circumference of the lumen, whereas the measurement of the largest width was done by drawing a line along the maximum width. So the scale gave measurements in pixels actually, which were calibrated to 3 × 3 scans using the ImageJ software to measure the width and the area of vessels in millimeter and millimeter square. So the analysis was done using SPSS software, and the mean of area and width was compared during baseline and post resolution using paired t-test, and the significance level was set at 0.05. Out of the 9 patients we had, 7 were males and 2 were females. The mean age was around 41 years. If you see the results, the best corrected visual acuity did improve significantly, and the greatest width of lumen and the area of lumen decreased in post resolution in these patients, whereas the choroidal thickness was the same, did not significantly reduce from baseline to post resolution. So these are some representative images I want to show. Well, this is during baseline, and you can see the lumen size which has decreased significantly at resolution. These are other images. Again, similarly, significant reduction of the size and the width of the lumen. With this one patient did not have a significant in the size of the lumen. So this patient again had a significant decrease. In this patient, the point of leak was exactly taken at the marked area, and we can see a significant reduction over here. The size, this lumen space has been decreased. So this was not a part of the study where we compared the lumen size from normal and CSC patients. If you see normal patients, the lumen was actually more slender than the CSC patients, which was more irregular. So to conclude, our study confirms the presence of dilated choroidal vessels, which is the basic pathology of CSC. And CSC is mainly a disorder of the failure of focal autoregulation of choroidal flow. So when resolution occurs when physiological compensatory mechanisms or therapeutic measures are somehow able to reduce the flow to the dilated choroidal vessel. future research will help in creating interventions targeting the choroidal flow through these larger vessels without leading to choroidal ischemia. And according to my study, choroidal thickness was not a good marker of disease activity, as it was mostly the focal caliber of a single large vessel which determined the activity. And limitations were obviously it was a small scale study with only 9 patients, and larger studies are required to establish results and discover new targeted treatment options. Periodic monthly scans could help in studying the dynamic changes in the lumen size, and whereas a control group is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nasik. So we have 2.5 minutes for discussion this paper.
So, Dr. Nasik, we already know that CSC is a part of the pachychoroid spectrum. And here what you're trying to again tell us is that the OCT is picking up a much wider or more, voluminous choroidal vessels. I mean, the large pachychoroid vessels. And we all know that during the active phase of the CSC, we do have the thickening of the choroid. So, I mean, what additional thing were you able to pick up by doing this study?
Ma'am, this is just basically a new investigation module which is showing the exact anatomy of the dilated vessel. And this could be used to in future treatment. For example, if we could see if the treatment is actually working. Like, we are working on different treatment options. Topical, even we're trying topical brimonidine in such patients to see, because as we have seen the physiology of these patients, the choroidal vessels have alpha receptors. So we've also devised we've just thought about new treatment strategies. So this could be a tool to see if whether the choroidal lumen size is decreasing with our treatment options, or are we going through the wrong path. Yeah, so this is mainly to look at our resolution phase.
This one, have you tried? Because these are all these CSR patients, right?
Yes, sir.
So have you tried it? Patient, those are just having a pachychoroid, no CSR, and having a pachychoroid and CSR. Have you compared that?
So we haven't compared. Yes, so we haven't compared them as such, but then we have seen these patients with pachychoroid who do have dilated choroidal vessels, but we haven't compared. We just compared with the normal patients in a different study.
That's exactly because you showed normal comparison. That's the reason I asked this question. So.
And we've also compared patients who did not go through resolution, and they still had the vessel. There was no significant reduction in the vessel size when the patients did not have a resolution of the CSC.
I think there are a lot of assumptions you make regarding you measure the vessel width manually, and your case number is small, so there may be a lot of overlap of the measurements, the data. So the SD and all will be overlapping. So I don't think it is so easy to measure it and tell that these 7 will decrease in a short time. So unless until you have a large data to support this.
True, sir. Actually, most of our patients, not most of our patients, around we had taken on 23 patients, sir, of which around those 14 patients did not come under the inclusion criteria. So we could only have data for these 9 patients. And the second thing is, there have been studies earlier where the choroidal vascularity index has been measured, where again they've measured the entire length or the entire area of the lumen, or the white spaces compared to the black spaces of the lumen, and they found that there was a significant increase in the choroidal vascular index in CSC patients. So ours was something based on that. So we just wanted to see if there's a specific vessel and what is happening exactly on an on-fast scan in these deeper layers. So this was actually it was an incidental finding. So in one patient, we just found out that there was an increase in we saw an abdominal lumen, and then we tried to extrapolate it into different other patients. We started reading scans and we saw these changes, sir.
So there are a lot of variations, like at what depth you measure the width of the vessel.
So we kept it.
If it are little superficial, you may measure it small, and if you are deep right at the broadest, you will measure it larger. So you are doing manually, so it may not be very accurate and it may not be very reliable. But the number of cases you are having.
So we kept the depth at the exact, so for all patients, we kept the depth at 150 to 300 microns. And what we saw is it was a superficial area. So when we went superficially, we could not find such abnormal lumen. So then we had decided that this is not an artifact due to the neurosensory detachment. This is a separate lumen which is quite deeper. But then yes, we kept it standard. We kept it 150 300 microns in all patients.
Not all patients will have same things. It's okay.
Exactly.
Nice.
Exactly.
Thanks a lot. I'll once again call on the absentees if they are present. They can present, otherwise we can call it a day for today. But Dr. Hans, if he is here.
1403 and 1584 are not presented.
Yeah, three people. Dr. Amandeep Hans.
Yes. 1227 also.
Dr. Raghudev Bhattacharjee and Dr. Gopeswari Hota. Dr. Sachin, have they informed you? They have not informed me, at least, that they'll be coming late or something.
No, they have not informed.
Sir, actually, we tried from our end, sir. There, some phone is switched off and somebody is not picking that. So we can conclude here, sir, for this session.
We call it up now? Nobody is there, right?
Yes.
All three are absent.
Yes, so we can assume that they will not be presenting in this session.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes,
Or
sir.
should we wait for them?
No, sir. No, sir.
I think we can call it off, Dr. Sangeet.
Right. So,
Even if it's late, it's a fair enough. We give them chance because they didn't come till we finish all the presentation. Unless they have some communication, lack of communication from their side. This is lot of yesterday's change of sessions, no? So, we have their contact numbers, right?
They have tried it. They have tried yesterday, it seems.
Right. Okay.
so with then I think we should call it a day. I
Sir,
thank
one announcement is there. Those who have participated for this session, winner of this session, sir, they have to present at 12:30 Eldar Hall. Just use a communicate.
Okay.
Eldar Hall, 12:30 today.
I'd like to announce that once again, all the presenters who presented their free paper or their presentation right now, the winner will be announced in the Elder Hall at 12:30 p.m.
No. Winner will be not announced. Winner will be announced early. Okay, after sending this mark sheet to site team, so they will get notified. Okay.
How will you send a message to the winner? Whether you will
Sir, in
pass
group,
a message?
sir, there is a group ना वो ग्रुप में सर आ जाएगा सर नोटिस बोर्ड में वो साइन है भेज देगा.
Okay. Okay.
ठीक है.
All the speakers they should check.
They should check, sir.
They should check the group, WhatsApp group, whether about the results of this session. And if your paper comes as a winner, you have to present at 12:30 in the Elder Hall for the semi-finals. I think, am I right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
You have to be there.
So with this, I thank all the judges and all the speakers for the was a lucid all the papers. I'll just remind the judges that they have to take a photo, they have to sign the mark sheet, and then they have to take a photograph, and then they have to send it to the AIS Secretariat or to Dr. Partha Biswas. Within 10 minutes of ending this session.
I think there is a separate number for marks.
Pardon?
Number to send the marks. We will send.
They have sent a WhatsApp number. They have sent a WhatsApp number and they have sent an email also.
Yes.
You have to send it there. So I thank again everybody who was there in this session.
The contestants were absent. No?
There are 3 absentees.
3 were absent.
Thank you, Dr. Sangeet, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So much.
We close this session now.
Everybody. Thanks. Nice to see you all.